Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. You know, there is a very specific kind of pressure that hits you when you transition from being a registered nurse taking orders to an advanced practice nurse actually calling the shots.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge shift.
Right, like you walk into an exam room and a patient just casually mentions their hands keep cramping up out of nowhere. And, you know, as a floor nurse, you might just chart it as a muscle cramp and move on.
Yeah, just another data point for the provider.
Exactly. But sitting in that provider chair yourself, for you, the student listening right now, your brain has to immediately scan through this massive web of metabolic and endocrine pathways.
You have to figure out, is this a benign quirk or a literal life-threatening emergency?
Because you are solely responsible for connecting that subtle physical finding to the underlying foundational science. It requires a completely different level of clinical reasoning.
It really does. You're the detective now.
Which is exactly why we are doing this deep dive today. We are taking that leap together using Chapter 57, Common Endocrine and Metabolic Complaints from Primary Care, the Art and Science of Advanced Practice Nursing.
It's basically your map for this transition.
Right. We're going to take the textbook theory on 5 major clinical complaints and, translate it into the real-world diagnostic logic you need to practice safely. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it. And starting with that exact scenario of the cramping hands, that is essentially your body's neuromuscular alarm bell for hypocalcemia.
Which is a drop in serum calcium, right?
Exactly. Physiologically, we define hypocalcemia as a serum calcium level dropping below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter.
Got it. 8.5 is the magic number.
Right. So normally when calcium dips, your parathyroid glands sense it and they release parathyroid hormone, or PTH.
And that PTH acts like a chemical messenger, right?
Yeah, it tells your bones to release stored calcium and your intestines to absorb more from your diet, which stabilizes the blood levels.
But when that compensatory loop fails, or the drop is incredibly sudden, say a plunge of 2 to 3 milligrams per deciliter, things go haywire.
Totally haywire.
I always find it helpful to think of calcium as the volume knob for your nervous system.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Because it's a crucial mediator for neuromuscular transmission. It actually stabilizes the resting membrane potential of your cells.
So if you abruptly turn down that calcium volume knob, the threshold for a nerve to fire actually drops.
Right. The nervous system becomes highly irritable. You don't get silence. You get acute, violent static and spasms.
And as the diagnostician, you need to know how to intentionally elicit that static to confirm your suspicions during a physical exam.
Right. You can't just wait for it to happen.
Exactly. You do this through Trousseau's sign and Chvostek's sign.
Okay, walk us through Trousseau's first.
So to check for Trousseau's, you place a blood pressure cuff on the patient's arm and inflate it to 20 millimeters of mercury above their systolic pressure.
Okay, so a bit tighter than normal.
Yeah, and the critical step here is holding that inflation for 3 full minutes.
Wait, 3 minutes? That feels like an eternity in a busy clinic.
It really does feel like forever, but the mechanism behind it is fascinating. By holding that pressure, you are deliberately causing localized ischemia to the ulnar and median nerves.
Oh, wow. So you're stressing the nerves on purpose.
Exactly. If the patient is already hypocalcemic, those nerves are sitting right on the edge of firing anyway. The added metabolic stress of the hypoxia pushes them over the edge,
triggering that violent, painful carpopidal spasm.
Yeah, you'll see their elbow and wrist flex, the thumb adduct sharply over the palm, and the fingers themselves hyperextend.
It creates a very distinct, almost claw-like posture.
It does. And then you have Chvostek's sign, which involves tapping the facial nerve just below the zygomatic arch.
Right in front of the earlobe, right?
Yep, right there. A hypocalcemic patient will exhibit an abnormal unilateral twitch or spasm of the facial muscles on that side.
And finding either of these signs immediately shifts your clinical reasoning to priority setting, specifically the airway, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The laryngeal muscles are incredibly sensitive to this neuromuscular irritability.
So if you see a positive Trousseau's or Chvostek's, and you hear stridor, that harsh, high-pitched crowing sound.
Or if you note cyanosis.
Right. Then you are looking at impending laryngospasm. That is a medical emergency requiring immediate transfer.
You don't mess around with that. The same goes for any lab result showing marked hypocalcemia, meaning the serum level below 6.5 milligrams per deciliter.
Good to know. So assuming the patient is stable and their airway is secure, your job becomes like clinical detective work.
Yeah. Sometimes the etiology is obvious, like recent neck surgery where the parathyroid glands were accidentally damaged.
Or maybe they're on a medication known to waste calcium, like the antiviral phoscarnet.
Right. But if the cause is hidden, your workup needs to be comprehensive. You must draw serum magnesium, phosphorus, and albumin alongside a PTH level.
And don't you also need a direct measure of vitamin D?
Yes, specifically the 25-hydroxycholesterol assay. Because chronic issues like severe vitamin D deficiency or malabsorption syndromes often hide right there.
It's honestly amazing how a subtle mineral deficit causes such dramatic external spasms.
It really is.
But sometimes the physical signs of an endocrine issue aren't spasms,
Yeah.
They are actual structural changes to the body itself.
Like systemic hormonal imbalances.
Exactly. And when those hormones alter body image, it profoundly impacts patient psychology. We see this vividly with androgen and estrogen imbalances, specifically gynecomastia and hirsutism.
Yeah, let's talk about gynecomastia, or GM. It's the benign enlargement of glandular breast tissue in individuals assigned male at birth.
And that stems from an altered ratio at the cellular level, right?
Right, either an absolute increase in estrogen, a decrease in androgens, or sometimes elevated prolactin. This hormonal shift stimulates the actual stromal and ductal tissues to grow.
But the clinical challenge for you as an APN is differentiating true GM from pseudogynecomastia during your physical exam.
Because pseudogynecomastia is simply adipose tissue deposition, usually from obesity.
Right, and you can't just look at the chest to tell the difference. It requires a really specific palpation technique.
Yeah, you have to examine the patient supine. This flattens the adipose tissue.
And then you grasp the breast tissue between your thumb and forefinger and gently walk your digits toward the nipple.
Exactly. You are feeling for a very specific texture. True gynecomastia presents as a firm or rubbery, mobile, disc-like mound.
Usually about 2 to 4 centimeters in diameter.
Yep. It arises concentrically from right beneath the areola. Because it is actual glandular stroma, it feels resistive and ropey.
Almost like a distinct separate structure under the skin, whereas adipose tissue just lacks that defined rubbery disc.
Exactly. And while true GM is incredibly common, affecting up to 57% of the male population at some point, our primary safety concern is ruling out malignancy.
Because breast cancer accounts for about 3% of GM cases, right?
Right. The massive red flags here are a mass that is unilateral, completely immobile, and firm or hard rather than rubbery.
And if it's growing rapidly painful or accompanied by skin dimpling or axillary lymphadenopathy, those are huge warning signs.
Furthermore, any disc larger than 4 centimeters automatically buys the patient a mammogram and a biopsy to rule out neoplasm.
That's a great clinical pearl. We also see this frequently in pediatric and adolescent primary care, though, which carries its own set of rules.
Oh yeah, a 13-year-old presenting with breast tissue development is often terrified.
Fortunately, pubertal GM, which typically onsets between 12 and 14 years of age, usually resolves spontaneously within 6 to 24 months.
So it rarely requires medication. Your role is mostly to reassure the family and measure the disc every 3 to 6 months.
But the pediatric red flags to watch for are onset before puberty, failure to resolve within 2 years, or an absence of secondary sex characteristics.
Those warrant an immediate pediatric endocrinologist referral, and always review the medication list.
Right, because about 15% of GM cases are drug-induced, aren't they?
Yeah, by things like calcium channel blockers, SSRIs, or highly active antiretroviral therapy.
Okay, so speaking of estrogen and androgen imbalances, we see the systemic flip side of that coin in female patients presenting with hirsutism.
Right, which is the abnormal growth of terminal hair in androgen-sensitive areas like the face, chest, and lower abdomen.
To understand the pathology there, we have to look at the hair follicles themselves. Normally, most of the body is covered in vellus hair.
That fine, soft, unpigmented peach fuzz.
Exactly. But in the presence of increased androgens or an increased sensitivity to them at the receptor level, that vellus hair transforms into terminal hair, which is thick, coarse, and dark.
The textbook notes that about 90% of hirsutism cases are either idiopathic or driven by polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS.
But the critical diagnostic reasoning for an advanced practice nurse is identifying the dangerous 10%, right?
Exactly. The major differential red flag is the rapidity of onset. Idiopathic hirsutism, or PCOS, develops gradually over years,
So if a patient presents with sudden onset or rapid progression of terminal hair,
especially accompanied by signs of virilization, like a deepening voice, clitoromegaly, or a receding temporal hairline,
then you must suspect an androgen-secreting ovarian or adrenal tumor. Those virilizing signs mandate an immediate laboratory workup.
you are drawing total and free testosterone and DHEAS.
And the specific cutoffs you, as a student, need to memorize are a free testosterone level greater than 200 nanograms per deciliter, or a DHEAS level greater than 700 nanograms per deciliter.
Why those specific numbers? Because benign PCOS simply doesn't produce hormone surges that massive.
Right, levels that high scream tumor. And you must initiate an adrenal and ovarian imaging workup immediately.
But for the vast majority of patients falling into the benign PCOS or idiopathic categories, understanding the underlying cellular mechanism dictates your management plan.
Which usually starts with weight reduction for obese patients, right?
Yes, and here's why. Excess adipose tissue leads to hyperinsulinemia. That excess insulin directly stimulates the ovarian Theta cells to produce more androgens. Okay. Furthermore, insulin decreases the liver's production of sex hormone-binding globulin, or SHBG.
So by losing weight, the patient lowers their insulin, which directly turns off that ovarian androgen factory.
And that SHBG mechanism is exactly how our pharmacological treatments work, too.
Right. Estrogen-dominant oral contraceptives are highly effective because the estrogen signals the liver to produce more SHBG.
I like to think of SHBG like a molecular sponge floating in the bloodstream. It just soaks up and binds to the free, biologically active testosterone.
And if the testosterone is bound to the sponge, it can't interact with the hair follicles.
Makes perfect sense. And for patients wanting a cosmetic adjunct while the hormones balance out, a fluorescein 13.9% cream, or Vanica, is an FDA-approved topical that physically slows the rate of hair growth.
So we have spent a lot of time discussing circulating hormones in the blood, but a patient will often present with structural changes to the actual source of many of those hormones.
You mean the neck? Yeah, exactly. They might not complain of thyromegaly, but rather note that their shirt collars have suddenly become too tight, or they feel a lump while swallowing.
And just like with our other complaints, step one is always safety. If any neck enlargement is accompanied by dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, or dyspnea, difficulty breathing,
that indicates the structure is compressing the esophagus or the trachea,
which demands a rapid diagnostic workup and specialty referral.
Absolutely. The clinical exam technique for the neck requires precision. You have the patient sit perfectly upright with their neck completely exposed down to the sternal notch.
And you stand directly in front of them so the thyroid is at your eye level, right?
Yes. Have them take several sips of water. The thyroid gland is attached to the trachea, so it will move upward when they swallow,
allowing you to observe for asymmetry or hidden masses before you even begin palpating both anteriorly and posteriorly. Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Because when you do palpate swelling, the exact anatomical location acts as a diagnostic map.
Right. You first determine if it's diffuse or focal. If the entire neck seems uniformly swollen, you think a diffuse pathology.
Like venous distension from congestive heart failure, or the uniform glandular hypertrophy of Graves' disease.
Or even subcutaneous emphysema. If it's that, you will actually feel the unmistakable crackling of trapped air known as crepitus under the skin.
But if the swelling is focal, like a distinct isolated mass, you evaluate if it is midline or lateral.
Midline masses typically follow the embryological descent of the thyroid, right?
Yeah, pointing strongly toward thyroglossal cysts or thyroid adenoma. Lateral masses, however, carry a very different weight.
A lateral mass could be a bronchial cyst, but more concerningly, it could be an enlarged lymph node.
And here is where your anatomical knowledge really matters. An enlarged node in the left supraclavicular fossa is known as Virchow's node.
And why is that specific node so alarming? Because it sits right where the thoracic duct empties into the left subclavian vein.
Right, and the thoracic duct drains the lymphatic fluid from the entire abdomen.
So a swollen Virchow's node often isn't a neck problem at all. It's a profound red flag for hidden gastric, pancreatic, or other abdominal malignancies.
It's wild how connected it all is. But regardless of the clinical presentation, any thyroid abnormality requires drawing a TSH and a free T4 to evaluate the functional status of the gland.
And it is worth remembering that palpable thyroid nodules are present in about 5% of the U.S. population.
and fewer than 10% of those are malignant. However, if you palpate a lymph node that is hard, entirely immobile, or has been slowly growing over several months,
that is highly suspicious for a neoplastic process and requires a biopsy referral for sure.
Whereas a node that is suddenly enlarged, soft, and tender is much more indicative of an acute infectious process.
Okay, so when that thyroid or the broader metabolic factory goes completely off the rails, we start seeing the systemic fallout.
Which brings us to the classic 3 Ps, polydipsia, polyphagia, and polyuria.
As an RN, you already know these mean excessive thirst, excessive hunger, and excessive urination.
But as an APN, the value isn't in defining them. It's in differentiating them using the diagnostic algorithm provided in figure 57.1 of your text.
Right. The combinations of these symptoms tell a very specific story. If a patient presents with all 3 simultaneously,
the differential diagnosis heavily favors diabetes mellitus or significant renal disease.
Because the mechanism is osmotic diuresis, right? The excess glucose in the blood spills into the urine.
Exactly, and it pulls massive amounts of water with it, triggering the polyuria and subsequent polydipsia, while the starving cells trigger the polyphagia.
But what if they only have polydipsia and polyuria? Like they are drinking constantly and urinating constantly, but their appetite is totally normal.
Now your algorithm shifts away from diabetes mellitus and points toward dehydration, diabetes insipidus, or hypocalcemia.
Conversely, if they have polydipsia and polyphagia, drinking a lot and eating a lot, but their urine output is normal,
the algorithm points directly to thyrotoxicosis.
I always picture thyrotoxicosis like pressing the gas pedal to the floor while the car is in neutral.
That's exactly what it's like. The elevated thyroxine, or T4, massively revs up the basal metabolic rate.
The engine is racing, burning through fuel, and generating heat at an incredible rate. The patient experiences polyphagia because their body is desperately trying to refill the gas tank.
To keep up with the metabolic demand, yeah. And they drink excessively to compensate for the heat and insensible fluid loss.
Because diabetes mellitus is the most critical and common diagnosis associated with the full triad of the 3 Ps, mastering the exact diagnostic criteria is a baseline safety requirement for your practice.
These are not arbitrary numbers. They represent the physiological tipping points where cellular damage begins.
Exactly. To formally diagnose diabetes mellitus, you need one of 4 criteria. First, a glycosylated hemoglobin, or HbA1c, equal to or greater than 6.5%.
Which measures the percentage of hemoglobin that has been permanently coated with sugar over the 120-day lifespan of a red blood cell,
giving you a long-term metabolic average. Second, a fasting blood glucose equal to or greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter after at least 8 hours of fasting.
And why 126? Because decades of epidemiological data show that crossing that specific threshold is where we see a steep, dramatic spike in microvascular complications.
Like diabetic retinopathy. The third criterion is a 2-hour postprandial plasma glucose equal to or greater than 200 milligrams per deciliter during an oral glucose tolerance test.
And finally, a random blood glucose level greater than 200 milligrams per deciliter, but only if the patient is concurrently exhibiting the classic symptoms of hyperglycemia.
Like our 3 Ps. Memorizing those specific cutoffs and the pathophysiology behind them is what separates data gathering from true diagnostic practice.
It really is.
We've covered a massive amount of clinical ground today, from understanding why inducing localized ischemia triggers the claw-like spasms of Trousseau's sign,
to palpating the rubbery stroma of Gynecomastia,
and from tracking the metabolic math of insulin and androgens in hirsutism, to recognizing that a swollen node in the neck might actually be signaling abdominal cancer. So what does this all mean?
Well, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to consider as you move into clinical rotations. Throughout all these endocrine pathways, there is a profound psychiatric overlay.
Oh, that's such a good point. We noted that chronic hypocalcemia can present with memory problems, emotional instability, or even psychosis.
And we know that polydipsia can sometimes be purely psychogenic. It fundamentally changes how you view patient history.
When a patient sits on your exam table, presenting with what looks like a classic mental health crisis, maybe severe new onset anxiety, profound depression, or cognitive slipping,
you have to ask yourself, how often might an entirely treatable underlying endocrine disorder be hiding behind a psychiatric mask?
Holistic assessment isn't just a nursing theory concept. It is a rigid clinical necessity.
And your clinical reasoning is the ultimate tool that clears those murky waters.
Keep trusting your foundational science, keep questioning what you see, and keep connecting those dots. Thank you for joining us for this session from the Last Minute Lecture team here on The Deep Dive.